Hey there, this is Matt with State of Flex here with my ranking video for all the Star Trek films. This has been almost a full year's journey. I started by rewatching many of the shows and now all of the movies, and I thought I would rank the movies that I've watched. I'm not going to include any of the shows, but I've seen 13 Star Trek movies, the complete library thus far of them, so I thought I'd do a ranking video. We'd start with the worst and work our way up to the best. How I feel about some of the ones in the middle kind of changed places here and there over time, so this video might change where I include another movie in this sometime down the line. However, my top 4 and my bottom 5 are pretty much in a solid lock. So let's get this started with my worst film in the library. Number 13 is Star Trek Into Darkness. This is a movie completely void of ideas. This is a movie that's equivalent to the Star Trek bowel movement. There's nothing here but afterthought and unused mess. That you can't really gain any nourishment from. So just expel it. It's like shockingly dumb, and this is the exact movie that I think people feared when they'd heard J.J. Abrams was going to be making a Star Trek movie in the first place. Just a rehash of ideas, getting us basically to Wrath of Khan, and you know what? That's exactly what this movie is. Star Trek Into Darkness is my worst film in the 13th spot. The worst part about this movie is that in a bubble, all the individual scenes kind of work in a bubble. But when you pull back and look at the wider picture, it does nothing to move forward the plot of the Kelvin timeline, like really nothing at all. He resets the film back to what the status quo was prior to the conclusion of the previous movie, only to get us to that same exact spot at the halfway point and then move forward. It's just so much dead air, it's a thoughtless movie, and it infuriates me. Moving on to the 12th spot, we have Star Trek the Motion Picture. I know a lot of people have reverence for this film, but when people call it the slow motion picture, they're not wrong. However, its slowness is not what bothers me. It's that it is a good movie. There is buried within it a 50-minute good episode of television that is just elongated so far past the point of no return that it just fails to captivate on anything other than a visual stimulus level. And the great parts that make it feel Star Trek-y are so spread thin in between that it just doesn't have that flair. That said, I am heavily amused that this is a film wherein Admiral Kirk continually demotes the acting captain of the Enterprise until former Captain Decker is just like, F it, I'm gonna F a robot and just die. Which is how this film concludes. And the little cherry on top of that dish is that in the closing moments, Kirk does a little like soliloquy to say bye to their lost captain, but then chooses not to include it in the historical records so that he can completely die in anonymity. Unintentionally hilarious, but yeah. That is the worst of the original series films for me, motion picture. I know that's going to be somewhat controversial, but I stand by it. Number 11 spot is Star Trek Nemesis, the worst of the next-gen films. This is a movie that has parts similar to motion picture that kind of work, but the, like, Picard versus his clone that is completely unbelievably not remotely looking like him. It bends reality. This is a movie where I like everything happening around the main plot of the film. I just can't stand the main plot of the film. And then it just has to include an ending reminiscent of Wrath of Khan to try to get the big emotional burst at the end, and finally give Brent Spinner something kind of interesting to do, possibly in a future film, that never really gets capitalized on in the features. It does a little bit in the Picard shows, but that's another video for another time next week. So we're going to move on to the number 10 spot. This is, by all accounts, most people's worst film. However, I think there is merit to Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. I don't think it's as bad as many people say. There are a lot of bad things in it, not the least of which is, like, it has severe continuity problems, it's an ugly movie, it is had a budget so slashed that it looks less good than what was actively being shown on television in Star Trek The Next Generation, which happened congruent to this TV show. And all of those things are unfortunate. It has no idea what to do with Uhura, so she's just sexualized, which is something that happens often in Star Trek, but that's something that I did think I forgot to mention in my original review, that is a criticism of the film. However, the element with which that I like of the film is its addressing of the televangelism and how a person can kind of weaponize belief into making people's past become joined to that belief, and how Sybok kind of acts as that figure, weaponizing people's past, weaponizing religion in order to serve a purpose that is ultimately just to capitalize on other people's gain. And it's something that I think is oft overlooked. People hear the wonky line of, "What does God need with a starship?" And they laugh rather than intellectualize at all what is actually trying to be said. Now, maybe what's trying to be said isn't as interesting as any of the films that surround it. However, I would argue that what is being said in this film is vastly more interesting than anything that happens in Star Trek Nemesis, and what is trying to be addressed is also more interesting than anything that happens in Star Trek Into Darkness. And weirdly enough, Star Trek the Motion Picture and Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, share a lot of similarities in what they're trying to kind of accomplish in sort of this godlike narrative, or dismantling of a godlike narrative. It's weird that people kind of praise one and shut down the other. This one often gets no defense, whereas the motion picture gets a lot of defense because it looks pretty, which tells me that if this didn't have its budget slashed so wholeheartedly, this would have more defenders too. But so many people are so concerned with the aesthetic of Star Trek, which is weird because if you watch that original series, it's fugly. But I digress. I hear what you're saying. This movie is not great, but I do think it's better than most people give it credit for. Moving on to the number 9 spot is Star Trek Generations. Now, historically, I used to have that a little lower on the list, and if I'm watching this film, it depends on where I rank, it depends on where I'm watching this film from. If I'm watching this from the perspective of a fan of the original series, which, if you watch it in chronological order without watching the TV shows in between, I kind of do view it as a continuity and passing of the torch of the original crew to the new crew, and from that perspective, it's terrible. It does not capture the voice of Captain Kirk. Spock, Bones, they're not in it. Instead, you have Scotty and Chekhov, who are just given the voices, the dialogue of those characters, not capturing their voices, their characters' voices, but capturing a Spock-like voice and a Bones-like voice. So none of the original crew just feels real and organic. The only thing that you can tether to it is that's not the dreamscape of of Captain Kirk in the Nexus. It is the dreamscape of William Shatner, the man who would like to just be out ranching and riding his horse and cooking food for his wife. That is William Shatner's ideal in a Nexus, not Captain Kirk, and we watched 6 effing movies leading up to that point. I sounded like Kirk there. Of Captain Kirk desperately trying to hold on to his starship. His Nexus scene should be at the helm of the original Enterprise. That said, that is not what we're given, because the writers of this didn't know how to capture their voices. If you're viewing this from the perspective of a Next Generation movie, it's actually pretty good. And this is the first time, this pass is the first time I've watched the film while watching the movie, the show, the movies. Then after Star Trek VI, I watched Next Generation, and going into Generations directly after Next Generation, the movie works infinitely better. It captures the voices and the characters of the Next Generation and passes the torch in a much more convincing way. So, if you are watching this from the perspective of TOS, this movie would probably drop a couple spots to below Nemesis for me. If you are watching this from the perspective of Next Generation, it lands in the 9 spot. And that's why I have it in the 9 spot. I will also say that I do think Captain Kirk needed a death larger than he was given in this film. He kind of dies just very ignominiously, and that is a huge disappointment. However, Shatner plays him very well, and if this is the last time we see Shatner as that character, which I believe certainly at this point is the case, then he has a final solid moment with his oh my, and then just he has good dead face. Alright, moving on to the number 8 spot is Star Trek Insurrection. This is, I think, in a weird way, while I'm watching it, my favorite of the Next Generation movies. However, every time I finish watching it, the movie just blips out of my memory. It's a fascinating experience. However, I do like it. It's not as grandiose in scope as the other Next Gen movies, or really any Star Trek movie, honestly, at all. It has the scope of a 2-part TV episode of like Voyager or Next Gen, but that's not a bad thing. Those are good shows, and I enjoyed watching those shows. So watching a big screen, big budgeted version of network television kind of worked for me, and Jonathan Frakes finds great ways to capitalize on all those characters and gives them singular and unique moments that I like. It's a good movie, if a bit forgettable. That said, F. Murray Abraham is fantastic. I like the facelift makeup that he's in, and there's no scene more uncomfortable than when he's yelling furiously and accidentally tears his facelifted skin and then just starts bleeding. That's a moment that's just very socially awkward for me, because I try to always put myself in the room whenever I'm watching a movie and see how I would react, to see if how characters are somewhat similar. And that was just so socially awkward. I would have nothing to say to that. Like, how would I say, do I acknowledge it? Do I look at it? Do I not look at it? That scene always makes me so uncomfortable. Moving on to Star Trek 7. The number 7 spot for Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. I like this movie a lot more than your average bear, and this one and the next one flip places for me all the time. It's really these 3 movies, the 7th place, 6th place, and 5th place, that alternate for me constantly. But I'm going to put this one here because its biggest issue is its villain. They felt the need to include Krug, the Klingon villain, in this film that I don't think really needs it. I wanted more time with the crew trying to reassemble, steal the Enterprise, get Spock, and bring him home. That movie and that narrative works enough for me. I didn't need any Klingon, I didn't need any antagonist. The antagonist could have just been the Federation saying, no, you can't take the starship, you can't go and see if he's still out there, no matter what's going on with Bones. And that would have worked for me. Yet they did include the Klingon thing, and every time you cut back to Klingon and the Genesis planet, the film kind of like slows its pacing and its momentum, and that is the weakest part. However, I think of all the Star Trek films in the original series lineup, this is the film that captures the characters the best from the TV show. This is the best use of Kirk, best use of Bones, best use of Scotty, best use of Sulu. It has solid use of Chekhov, and Uhura's in it. She never really got a chance to shine in the films, and that's a shame. She's in that Of Gods and Men fan film as Uhura, which is a much better send-off to her character than she ever got any of the features. And if you haven't watched it, it is on YouTube. Do check it out. Nichelle Nichols is phenomenal. But I like Search for Spock a lot, and it's one of the ones where the more I watch it, the more I really do like it, because I love what they do with the characters. Leonard Nimoy also made a film that I think is arguably better looking than Wrath of Khan. He has a little more color to it, it has a little bit more pop, and it has a more diverse cast. If you watch the Wrath of Khan, it's kind of a whitewashed crew, but by the time you get to Search for Spock, there's a diverse grouping of people, both human and alien, and it's nice to see that. That feels more authentically Star Trek to me. So I have to give props to that, and that's something that I failed to mention in my review of Star Trek 3. Moving on to the number 6 spot, we have Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home, a film that I really like. A lot of people have this way higher on the list. A lot of people, this is their favorite film. It isn't for me, yet I do love it. From kind of 7 on up, these are all movies that I quite love, and this one is really good. It has quite a bit of humor to it. It has the best kind of energy of any of these Star Trek films. I think it is the most inviting Star Trek film because largely it does not take place in space. It takes place in familiar territory. The 80s are a very nostalgic time period now, so it's even good to bring new fans on board even by today's standards. And it has positive save the whale messaging, which is both very distinctly 80s and something that I think most people should and could and do agree with in general. Leonard Nimoy directs the hell out of this picture. It is funny as can be. It has great moments for all the characters, just like the previous film did. I think Nimoy, sorry, I got hair in my eye. I think Nimoy was the best at working with these actors to find character moments. Now, he didn't necessarily weave them in organically into the narrative as well as, say, Nicholas Meyer does in his films. However, he finds character moments that feel authentic to the character and work within the film, not necessarily in the narrative specific. But I love Voyage Home. It is a good movie. Moving on to my number 5 spot is Star Trek Beyond. This one moved up my list quite a bit in the recent rewatch, and I think time has held on well to this film, which a lot of people had pushed it down, and I think a lot of that had to do with the Star Wars of it all, because it came out between 2 spectacularly huge Star Wars movies of varying quality, that just it kind of eclipsed this one, and everybody's mindset was so Star Wars that Star Trek just kind of fell by the wayside. Now that Star Wars has fizzled out of cinematic relevance whatsoever at this point, and the shows have had diminishing quality, similar to some of the reaction to earlier CBS All Access Star Trek shows, and the shows have been suddenly getting better kind of post-pandemic, and then this movie, upon my revisit, worked a lot better. I think Trek is on a nice solid upswing, and the relevance of this film is quite strong. If this is the last we see of the Kelvin timeline, I'm fine with it. It is a solid send-off, but this, more than any other Star Trek anything, feels like a perfect encapsulation of what the original series was. This captures great character moments. It works those character moments into the narrative, which is why I pull this one above the other 2 on this ranking. It finds a narrative use for all the characters to have a purpose, a function, a dramatic moment, and it doesn't do it at the expense of any of the characters' integrity. I think it is a great use of character. It is more visually interesting than either of the J.J. Abrams pictures. Justin Lin is, I think, honestly a better director, even though he's helmed a lot of those Fast and Furious films. He's also done other films that are quite good. He did Better Off Tomorrow? Better Luck Tomorrow? Oh my god, I'm blanking on the name. But Better Tomorrow, which is a fantastic movie, and he does great work with this as well. Justin Lin is a strong director, and I like what he did with this film, and Chris Pine is at his perfect peak at playing Captain Kirk in this film. I loved it. Moving on to the number 4 spot. The movies here on up are all phenomenal movies, no notes kind of situation. In the number 4 spot, we have Star Trek 2009. Historically, I've had this one just a tiny bit higher, but I really do like this movie. I think this was a great rebrand of Star Trek. It doesn't necessarily feel wholly Star Trek, but it takes all these different elements from other forms of pop culture, the drama that you got in Lost, the visual flair that you got in Firefly and Serenity, the speed and momentum that you got with Star Wars storytelling, and plucked it into a Star Trek setting. For some people, it rubbed them the wrong way. For me, the first time out, I thought it worked. It has great use of character. I will say the criticism of this compared to Star Trek Beyond is that there is humor done at the expense of the character's intelligence for almost every character across the board, which is disappointing. However, the reason I put this one above Beyond is I think it is a much more emotionally resonant story, that the emotional aspects of the story work very well. Bruce Greenwood does a hell of a job elevating this film as Captain Pike, and I think just overall this is a better story with a little more significant of a villain, and it had a big dramatic shake-up moment with the destruction of Vulcan, a controversial moment that I couldn't believe they stuck to, and it worked, while also giving us a solid send-off to Leonard Nimoy. Yes, I know he's in Into Darkness, but that movie is a forgotten poop mess, remember. This feels like a solid send-off to of Leonard Nimoy passing the torch to a new crew, saying, it's okay, this can be your Star Trek now. So I like Star Trek 9, plus Chris Hemsworth. Oh my god, that man brings me to tears. That opening 10 minutes is some of the strongest opening 10 minutes of blockbuster storytelling I've seen in the past 20 years. It is that great of an opening. Moving on to the number 3 spot, we have Star Trek First Contact. This is the best, unanimously, I think, across the board. Everybody will say this is the best of the next-gen movies, and they're right. This is the best one. It is mentally engaging in how it sort of deconstructs heroification and how that happens with the Zefram Cochrane character, who is representative of all those idols that we have, that we idolize. And do we do it rightfully? Do we acknowledge their faults, or do we sort of mythologize them to be worthy of these great statues, looking off and ignore the fact that they might be kind of garbage human beings underneath that, or have really sinister paths that don't get explored? These are something that is very relevant to the whole world, and is something that we can all relate to, on top of having a really fluid, strong, action and thrilling adventure story with the Borg going back in time, manipulating everything we know about Star Trek to the point where it could not happen anymore at all if the heroes don't succeed. And it has great moments for most of the next-gen crew, with a great standout for Jean-Luc Picard. It is great. Alfred Woodard is there, and she is just a delight. And I think Star Trek First Contact is fantastic. Jonathan Frakes directed the hell out of that movie. He finds those character moments. He gives you thrilling action. It's a high-intensity film. You'll love this movie, as do I. Moving on to the number 2 spot is Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country. This is, I think, the most mentally stimulating film of any of the Star Trek films. It is sort of a deconstruction on prejudice and how we hold those accountable for the wrongs that have been done to us, whether it's right or not. And this is a true growth moment for the character of Captain Kirk. It is a perfect, beautiful send-off of the original crew, and a kind of lovely murder mystery that Spock has to try to solve. It has some of Shatner's best acting, and him acting opposite of Leonard Nimoy, especially in the earlier scenes of the film, are very challenging, very interesting, and David Warner is so good as the Klingon Emperor that it's just great. This movie doesn't necessarily get its praises sung, and if this film honestly didn't have that 10 minutes of dead space on the ice planet, I think I would have this in my number 1 spot. But that scene, those scenes are just, they stop the momentum dead for like a 10 whole minute section of the film that's otherwise kind of perfect. That now I just use that as an excuse to go and make like ramen or something and then come back and enjoy the back half of the film. But it really does just kind of stop this film that is otherwise perfect, which is why it's not in the number 1 spot. And that means that the number 1 best Star Trek movie of all time is Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Everybody knew this was coming because it is the best Star Trek movie. I sung its praises in a full review form. This is the most emotionally resonant Star Trek film, full stop. It has William Shatner's actual best performance that I think he's ever given. Nicholas Meyer wrote, uncredited, one of the best dialogue-driven screenplays I have seen for a major blockbuster movie of its ilk. This is my favorite movie of the 80s. You have a great hammy performance by Ricardo Montalban as Khan that's sinister, with James Horner's stunning score. James Horner is one of the best composers that has ever touched film. His passing was a true loss, but his work for this film is my favorite work that he's done, and that's saying something. This is the man who composed Titanic. This is the man who composed Aliens, or any number of things. That list goes on and on too. But his work here is great. I find myself on a weekly basis whistling absent-mindedly the theme for Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. This is a good-looking action film that is done on a much tighter budget than the motion picture, even though it recycles some of the same vis effects from motion picture. You wouldn't be able to tell because it's utilized so well. And everything surrounding it is great. I like the look of this film. I like the performance work, the character work, the sinister nature of Khan, who is truly one of the best screen villains, I would argue, and something that Star Trek has chased ever since 1982 to attain something even remotely similar to Khan, and they've never been able to, so much so that in their worst Star Trek movie, they just recycled Khan. Wrath of Khan is the best film, and it had the strength of narrative to conclude with the death of a major character and not buy it back, which is the difference between the best film and the worst film in this franchise. Eventually it would be bought back in Star Trek III. Nicholas Meyer had nothing to do with that. However, he did have some uncredited, or I think it is credited, screenplay work done for the 4th film and the 6th film, and when he wrote and directed the 6th film. When asked why he was comfortable coming back to Star Trek, he said, I hadn't if it were up to him, he was like, if it were up to me, I never would have killed Spock. However, somebody else brought Spock back, so now that he's back on the board, I'm willing to play with that character, which is a good justification for why he was involved with 4 and 6 as well. But if you notice, this man touched the 3 arguable best original series movies. I think actually inarguably the 3 best original series movies, and he touched a bit of Star Trek Discovery, if memory serves. He helmed one of those episodes as well. I haven't seen it, maybe it's not good. I've heard varying quality on Discovery. But regardless, Wrath of Khan is my favorite movie of the 80s. It is my favorite Star Trek movie. But now it's time for me to hear from you. What is your favorite Star Trek movie? Give me your ranking in the comments section down below. What do you think of my list? You can trash me for including Final Frontier. Even though I am a defender on it, I will remind you that I do put it in the 10th place. It's not in like the top 5 or anything like that. But I love this franchise, I love these movies, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch. And I look forward for that Michelle Yeoh Star Trek movie that supposedly is happening at the end of this year or early next year. They haven't quite committed to that, so who knows if it's even happening. Thanks for watching, like, subscribe, and live long and prosper, my people. Bye. Oh, forgot. Next week, we are going to be addressing Star Trek Picard Season 1. Now, thanks for watching, like, subscribe, do all that good stuff. Peace.